All right. Hi, everyone. It's Lindsay again. And today I have a special guest. It's somebody that I have not talked to in quite a few years. And actually, Paty, you could unmute yourself. Could you introduce yourself to the people?
Sure. So I'm Paty, or in the workforce, I'll introduce myself as Patricia Santoyo Marin. I use she, her, hers pronouns.
Yeah, and also, so I also just want to say how I know Paty. When I was in my freshman year of college, I want to say I met you within the first few weeks through common friends because we were living in the same dorm. And I don't, it just came to mind, but I think when I specifically met you is because, yeah, we had a couple of friends in common, and it was to see Y Tu Mama También at La Casa Cultural Latina at University of Illinois. So that tells you something about how far back we go. If you don't know that movie and you see the year, you will know how far back she and I go.
Yes, yes. Yeah, you're reminding me I need to dye my hair. All these gray hairs coming in.
My goodness. But yeah, no, I mean, so it's just, yeah, and it's just been, it's interesting. I don't talk to you like every day, every year, but I feel like the times that we've come together and talked, it's been like really natural. Even before I just hit play on this, it's been natural. I think the last time I saw you was a few years ago at like a conference
Mhm.
in Philly. And,
Yes.
but yeah, again, it was just, like no time had passed.
Right. I think that's like every time I share with my partner, I tell him like, oh, I'm gonna meet with Lindsay, and he's like, wait, like you guys just pick up where you left off, and I'm like, yes. I feel like we're comadres, like we're like we go from back in the day, and like we're when I talk to you, it's like, I think with work and with life, we grow and we maybe evolve and change, but it's really nice to have those authentic relationships where like, well, I saw you at the party, so don't trip. We're in a good space, or we walk through this together, right? So those are like relationships that I think are so important. And I always tell like students about like when you're in college, these are the friendships that you're going to make for a lifetime. So yeah.
No, for sure. Well, not all of mine have survived a lifetime, but it's nice to know that with you, it's gone all this way. And so I guess for people who aren't so familiar with you, like just what are some of the basics like you want people to know? I mean, aside from what you've shared so far.
Sure. So obviously, English is not my first language. Spanish is my first language. I was born and raised in the southwest side of the city. So when I say that, that means Chicago. So I do have the Latina accent, the Chicago accent. I have a White Sox family. So that means we're from the south
Mm,
side.
no, lovely.
um, and so my parents are from Mexico, first generation college, first generation American, if you will. And my career is in higher education administration with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then, I'm just me. So yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and I was telling you earlier that, I have other friends who work in diversity and inclusion, or some places diversity, equity, inclusion, and they add justice, or sometimes if they want. And from what I could tell, for people who've been in this field, obviously the George Floyd case happened, and what I'm seeing is that people are in high demand now with what you do. And it doesn't matter if it's in higher education, the corporate space, healthcare. It's, I guess, could you, because we keep hearing in the headlines, there's like, oh, there's this reckoning with racism, this reckoning with racial injustice. What does that mean for someone who's in a role like yours, like right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's definitely a challenge because it's what we enjoy to do. And I feel like we've always been like, hey, knocking on the door. And it's always been like, listen to us. This is wrong. What can we do to help our students? Or, let's revisit these ideas, or let's analyze, let's talk about this. Um, but now it's like, oh, all of a sudden everyone wants to pay attention. So it's like this internal conflict, at least for me, of like, yes, finally we're at the table. But at the same time, a little bit of like, well, I've been telling you so. How come now you want to talk about this? Why now? Because it's convenient, because of the cancel culture, or why now? Is it because we have this urgent that? Why is it that now we're ready to talk about it? And so that's like a kind of push pull of like, yes, let's take advantage of the opportunity, but at the same time, it's like, well, it's the same old. You never really wanted to talk about this, did you? Oh, you want me to talk about this in 30 seconds. So it is pretty demanding. And I think, when you reached out too, I think it was like, what, almost 2 months ago. And I was new in my current role. And I came in and, a week later, we started having some situations in Chicago where I work. And so I needed to address safety of our students first, right? And their immediate needs. So I couldn't even get to the trainings, but everyone was looking at me. And then I'm also with the leadership team, I'm the only Latina, right? And so it's, how do we talk about
Question.
this? Yes.
You said you're the only Latina in leadership. Mm-hmm. Are you the only person of color?
I'm not.
Okay.
Just
curious.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But
yeah, still the only Latina, still.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it is a Hispanic serving institution, which means that at least 25% of our student population identifies as Latinx. And there's, other demographic details about the students. But at my institution, it's about 40%. So they've never had a role like mine before, and much less in a leadership capacity.
No, geez, I mean, but honestly, when you told me the job, I'm like, yeah, that sounds like something you would have done, like, even if it is, like you said, like, a new role for you. But like, so I'll tell you, when I'm talking to, like, say, other people I know who do work similar to yours, I guess so especially like for some people I know in higher ed, it's coming at a time where yes, it's not just after George Floyd, but it's also during COVID, where obviously we know that has particular implications for Black and Brown folks. It's hitting those communities harder. And then on top of that, like because of the pandemic, that there's now this financial situation where there are furloughs, there are layoffs. It seems like people's capacity to do work is like being reduced because of what their institutions' budgets could afford. But then I think particularly what I'm hearing, and you could tell me how it is for you, what I'm hearing from other diversity and inclusion folks is that it's like now, like everyone else's capacity, it's shrinking, but then you in particular are being asked to do more because of the time that we are in, and because, yes, like you've said, there's this urgency to it. So like I guess if that is your situation, just how do you manage all of that, especially because at least when I talk to someone else, it's like, oh, now it's just like workshop requests galore. And like you said, doing it within a certain short time frame on issues that are so complex and nuanced and not one size fits all, because you work with diversity and inclusion.
Right. It's not here's a pill, take the pill, and then all the problems of the world are attended or fixed, right? It is very challenging, but like you said, maybe this is the role that you saw me, leading in. This is what I've been doing since I was a kid, and so for me, this is still my passion. It's serving the underserved. It's supporting and advocating for those voices that are often not at the table. It's leveraging the voices of the communities that maybe I identify within, or the communities of those that need to be at that table. And so for me, it's a passion, and I find the time to do it, but that in itself is not very equitable, right? So I do push back, but there's this kind of like, what privilege do we have to push back, right? So do I have the privilege as a Latina or as a professional of color to say, no, thank you, or sure, let me get back to you after I attend to the students' needs first? How do we address those multiple needs? And so I think that's often a challenge. And so what I do is I also walk through some challenges with my health. So I had to step away for a couple years from my career to attend to that. And I don't I don't want to go back to an unhealthy place. And so I practice, you know, balancing things a little bit better so that I don't get sick. And then just like, it is what it is. This is what I can do within my 8 hours, or within, you know, whatever time I allocate to my career, because this work is not just mine. And then putting it on people as well, right? So here are some resources, do some work. Here's your homework before we can get started on a conversation.
So like say, okay, like if we're doing, like, let's say I'm someone coming from another office, and actually in my actual work, I work in career development, right? And like say we worked at the same institution, and I go, oh, like Paty, you know, I'm seeing what's going on in the world. We're having this reckoning, and then obviously COVID is impacting like different communities at different rates. You know, like what types of, like, I guess, what is usually an ask? Is it a workshop? Is it a, like, I think sometimes people hear diversity and inclusion and it sounds like this very huge abstract thing, but like, what does it mean in an actual concrete way? Because honestly, and it sounds, I know because this has been your life since you were young, this might sound so stupid and basic to you, but I swear, but yeah, you know that for someone out there, they honestly, they're like, oh, she you know, that Patricia Santoyo Marin just talked about, like, letting voices be heard. Like, okay, but for that person where that's like a new concept, what, like, can you give, like, and obviously I know you do so many things, could you give a few key examples of what that means, like in practical, meaningful terms for
Sure.
students, staff, faculty, whoever the stakeholders are?
Yeah, so it depends on the institution, right? Every institution has different culture, a different level of kind of where they're at. In my current institution, the senior leadership said, can you start with like the basics of like a glossary of terms? Do we use this term? Do we use that term? And I was like, okay, so that tells me that after that, we need to read something like white fragility, and then we need to learn into how to be an anti-racist, right? So that's telling me kind of what your professional development looks like. So that is kind of, you know, part of what I do. But then leveraging the voices of the underserved means giving them a platform. So like maybe creating a student leadership advisory board, or creating a consortium of, like, depending on the preferred terminology, like a multicultural club council leadership group, right? And so we're listening to these concerns, and so we're advocating for their needs by creating a hub where we can listen, actively listen, and then we're also empowering them to continue to self-advocate. So, you know, what I do with students is, like, you know, creating that space, you know, doing a lot of reflective, like, so am I hearing that this, and then giving it the proper terminology so that they can then say, that's exactly what, you know, that's a microaggression. Okay, like, so how do we develop a plan? With colleagues in different spaces, I ask by, like, so tell me, you know, what are some of the things that you're hearing? Or what are some of the challenges that you're facing? And so then I do kind of like an internal assessment of where they're at in their knowledge, in their outreach, and then I'm able to give some recommendations for them to act on, for them to create some platforms for them to create a challenge. And some of the things that a lot of folks think we do is like, oh, there's a student and they have an accent, or there's a student and they're a student of color and they're not being successful, and we don't know what they want, so here, let's send them to Paty. That is actually like the opposite of what we want to do, right? We want to, just the same way we empower students, we want to empower our colleagues to have the cultural pedagogy or the training or the know-how to service everyone equitably. Does that make sense?
It does. Actually, what you just said kind of reminds me of a past experience I've had where, like, okay, actually, I'll say this, and then we could also, like, build upon this. But, you know, for example, like, so even though I'm someone who cares about all the same issues you care about, I have never actually done a formal role in it. But I feel like because I'm someone who cares about it, anything I do, whatever role I do, will have that. But what I'm also finding, especially ever since this George Floyd case, is that there's what I'm hearing across different, like different companies and whatnot, from like friends or whatever, is that there's so much focus on optics. So in some ways, I feel like even though I am that like, you know, there are people like me where we're just like, oh, you know, whatever work I do, I look at it through such and such lens. I feel like, you know, with a lot of companies or other organizations, I think they feel like they need to have that diversity person. They need to have that diversity workshop with the diversity and inclusion and equity and justice stamp to make it feel official, to make it feel legit. And I don't know, I just wanted to get some of your opinions on that, because you could push back on me, but I just feel like if certain like companies, institutions, if they were already doing the work, I don't know if there would be, and maybe I'm wrong, but there might not be as much of a need for that special, like, would there be as much of a need for your role, right? If we all just took our share, or maybe your role would look different if more of us took our share of the work. How does that sound?
Yeah, I think, sorry, that's my dog having too much fun in the background. So I think that an example of that, if I'm understanding correctly, is like in certain institutions, they would like to see a multicultural center, or a center that provides service to a certain subset of students, right? So, or like how we met at La Casa Cultura Latina, right? And so that may be a need. The ideal situation is where the whole institution is doing what they need to do, so that we don't need to find that one person or that one space where we're like, finally someone who gets me, finally someone who understands what I'm trying to say, or a place where I can code switch, where I can be me, where I can be validated or applauded. So that would be the ideal case. Unfortunately, our society is not there, and that's why, you know, folks like us, in whatever roles that we're in or outside the formalities, we're addressing this, right? Maybe we live through it, we feel passionate about it, formal or informal, we know what's right, and we know what we feel and how we've been excluded as well.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. And, you know, I was talking to another colleague at another institution in higher ed. It was kind of interesting, but, and I'm sure this is not the one place it's happening, but I'm gonna have to just keep it very vague. But basically, the George Floyd case happened, and then, like, obviously we know all these institutions have had this desire to, like, oh, you know, focus on equity, la 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 la, and it's interesting. But sometimes I think then they go, like, say maybe to that single Black person in the office, and it's like, here, take the lead. But then and like, obviously with what's happening in the world right now, I think in that particular person's case, she was saying this was a Black person who had to deal with family issues related to COVID, like, because we know that it's been hitting that community like super hard compared to others. We know, and obviously there's just the anti-Blackness, the racism, and then now that person, like, this person didn't sign up for a D&I role, but now they're taking the lead. But then it's funny because sometimes when you know, like, say people in the more marginalized groups aren't being given that leadership, then I know that even I personally, I'm like, why isn't the person who's marginalized, like, in charge of it? It's just, it's very, and I don't know. It's interesting. I feel like there has to be a way to, like, look to the people who are most impacted, closest to the pain, for, like, everyone to figure out what their part is. But at the same time, I don't know. It's just that balance between what, like, who takes the lead, and, like, I guess just like, how do you make the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion equitable for the people most impacted, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's kind of like, for example, if we were to take it out of race for a second, but, like, obviously if there might be, like, an initiative for, like, women's empowerment, would it have to always go to you and me in an office if we're in an office of mostly men? And I don't know. I feel like it doesn't matter who I talk to in what office. People just have strong feelings about what is being done. And how do you help, I guess, maybe people in more leadership roles at an institution navigate that when they're trying to, like, be led by the people most impacted, but then they don't necessarily want to give it all And there's not a magic formula, but what are some of your tips for that? Because I think it's honestly an area where you could tell a lot of companies are struggling with this.
Yeah, definitely. And it is a struggle for those of us who hold these identities as well, right? So like particularly in Chicago, we've had an unfortunate history of these racial challenges, right? With Black and Brown communities. You know, before George Floyd, we had Laquan McDonald. We've had a history of marginalization. There's templates that have been created in Chicago to marginalize and oppress, that have been replicated in other spaces, right? And so that's an ongoing challenge. So what I recommend to institutions, and every institution can be different, every organization is slightly different, but let's take the example of a domestic violence survivor, right? At that moment, yes, we want to validate, we want to acknowledge that something happened and that the person is a survivor. But I'm not going to ask, what type of coaching do you need at this time? You know, I may ask, are you okay? Do you need a safe place tonight? Have you eaten? Would you like for me to call someone? And I am not an expert in that field, but just for the purpose of an example, right? You want to address those immediate needs. And so as a supervisor, I would address those immediate needs with my colleagues, those who identify under those identities. Are you okay? Do you want to talk about this? Do you need some time off? Is this affecting you or your environment? What flexibility can I give you to walk through this? Do you want to talk about it? Can I give you a platform? Do you want us not to even talk about it? Is that triggering? So that it's one time that we assess for our employees. Now, there will be some employees who are ready to talk about it. They've been advocating, they've been saying this over, and they're like, finally, can you finally listen to me, right? There's always going to be a strong person to say, hello, now can you finally talk to me, right? So let's be ready to have everyone in that spectrum, from the person who is walking through it with some more challenges up to the person who's like, I've been telling you, I told you so, so now what, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another example maybe is at my current institution, I said, we have all of these items that we need to address, but my brother was working security in Chicago, and I was worried about his safety because there was some there was I want to be responsible in how I share this. There
Okay.
was some misunderstandings between the Black and Brown community in certain neighborhoods in Chicago.
I heard
And
about
we're
this.
very,
Yep.
thank you. We are very strong when we're together, and we are together today, and I look forward to us being together. But there was a slight hiccup, and that could have gone in a very bad way. And so there's some great community leaders who bridge those, communication gaps, and we're in a much better place. Now, when that hiccup happened, my brother was working security in a territory that's like considered the border between the Black and the Brown community. And so here I have, a senior leader reaching to me with questions and so forth. And I'm just like, look, I'm worried about my nephew in back of the yards. I'm worried about my brother. And I'm saying neighborhoods now, sorry for the non-Chicago folks.
Like they could look up back of the yards. You know what, say the neighborhoods. I don't care. Like this is, you say what you yeah.
Here's my nephew in back of the yards. Here's my brother in the west side of Chicago. I'm trying to make sure they're okay. So don't come to me with theoretical ideas or assessments of your department right now. Let's make sure that everyone who is from these neighborhoods, all of us who work here, are okay. So that would be my recommendation, that sometimes we address things at different levels. And we want to make sure that we're not walking through like, well, let's look into this. Let's find a solution, while not acknowledging that there are people who experience this every day and that experience this in different levels, right? Mm-hmm. So there will be someone who needs some assistance from you as a leader, to say, I need to step away, I need a day, I need to process this. And then there will be others who are like, I've been waiting for the microphone. So I guess there's no perfect answer, but I think as a leader, we need to assess kind of like where we're at and recognize that we have people that are experiencing this at our tables.
No, for sure. I mean, it's kind of no, it's like something that's been on my mind. Did it just get suddenly dark? Like, is that like hold on, let me put on my light in my kitchen.
Okay.
But oh, okay, just a little bit of extra light. You can barely, but it, yeah. So anyway, no, I mean, yeah, no, I what you're talking about, it's like, you know, I've seen it in the news, and it's just interesting because, like, you know, I'm no longer in Chicago, but then I did see what you were talking about, and it was, I mean, it's just hard, even if it wasn't even, it's not my immediate community anymore, but there's always going to be that connection. It's kind of interesting though to like go to work or like virtual work, right? And you know, like people are going through such, you know, to that point about like people being impacted on different levels. I'm not gonna. It's just really been on my mind, especially from as someone who works in career development. That like there, I've noticed that like ever since this pandemic started, that people are working harder than they ever have. There is all this pressure to show productivity, especially in a time where budgets are being cut. There are furloughs, there are layoffs, and I feel like the people who come out of this is like, oh, like you really survived a lot. I mean, there's going to be a lot of privilege tied into that, and I'm trying to like really personally manage what I think of that, because I'm just concerned about how this pressure for productivity is also coming at a time where the people who are impacted the most through COVID, through racism, anti-Blackness, and all of that, like what is quote unquote professional or professionalism now, especially when we're in this virtual, like not everyone, because there are definitely people still going into like whatever building or field or whatever they're going into, right? There's some people who can't work from home, and I'm going to acknowledge that. But as many people who do have the option to work from home are, I don't know. I must say I'm thinking a lot about what does it mean to be professional, and could we unpack what that means, especially because professionalism in itself, even before the pandemic, even before all of this, was already coded a certain way. And I'm wondering, I don't know, I just wanted to know, like, so you're not someone that works in a career center, but like what your thoughts are on how we, especially with people in my type of role, how we could talk about professionalism now, like in a time when that wall between the professional and personal is just like crumbling, like it's crumbling for a lot of people. And like I think in the past with like people in different groups we've interacted with, I think a lot of us, I can't speak for now, but at least like from what I remember in college, we were always taught to like, you know, be strong, and I mean that in a very specific way. Be strong, be resilient, like, you know, mind over matter. And I just don't know if that playbook's going to work for us right now. I mean, because I mean it works to a point.
Right.
But like, can we afford to keep using that playbook during a pandemic and a time of racial injustice, specifically anti-Blackness? I honestly, I don't know. Like, I never completely bought into those messages. But yeah, I don't know. What do you make of it? And I know this isn't like the neatest question, but it like the whole concept of it has been on my mind, right?
Yeah. I think, you know, for someone, and I think we share this identity, if I'm not mistaken, that we're both first generation Americans, right? And so at least in the United States, we're first to be, you know, white collar perhaps, or professionals. At least I am, right? And so I've always had to code switch. I'm always like, for real, this is what networking is. I feel so fake about it. You know, like I'm just coming from a different space of like, we need to build authentic relationships. Why is this just like a me? Why isn't it we, right? We're a collective. And so, you know, I think that's one of the awesome things about like our experience in undergrad. You know, we were friends. and we were part of a larger crew, if you will, a larger posse, or we had individual, groups of friends, and then collectively, I think that's kind of like how I got my start in my career, because I was seeing that, I myself left the college, and you probably don't remember. I used to call it my second freshman year.
I remember this. I do.
But, so I left the college because I was culture shock coming from Southside Chicago, attending a top tier school in central Illinois, where there were very few people that looked or spoke like me. And then the second time I came around 2 years later, I was like, you know what? Forget this. I'm going to make this my town. I'm going to be brown and proud, although I have lighter hair by choice. But, I'm going to be who I am. However, in the profession, I consider myself to still be authentic, but we always have to code switch a little bit more than I think we should, right? And so for me, I am in a very privileged position to be able to work more from home. And I also live in a city called Kankakee. And that is actually between Chicago and where we attended school. So it's not even considered a Chicago suburb. It's like another small city. It's a beautiful city, that I now call home. And in this city, it's very diverse when it comes to Black, Brown, and Caucasian folks. And there's still some friction when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we're moving forward in what I think is the right direction. There's lots of opportunities, but in doing so, it's like, oh, well, there's very few Latinx professionals out here. I feel a sense of responsibility to give back. When I moved out here and I was unable to work because of my health, I thought, I was like, okay, let me start a nonprofit. Let me start helping my neighbors. Like, I benefited from institutions, non-governmental institutions of support in the city when I was growing up. Like, what is this youth going to do without like some role models? And not to say that I'm the best role model, but like, how can we bring resources here? Let's do something, right? And so I think the way I see it through my privilege lens is we have an opportunity to redefine what this looks like. We have an opportunity to say, yes, I want this. Now I got a taste of that. And now I want that as well. Or I make my own, right? So I think something that I'm learning from the Zennial generation is all the entrepreneurship, right? Like this model of like, I want to be inclusive, and I also want to build my own. I don't want to work for the man, if you will, right? So I'm like, hey, that takes some guts. Like, where are mine? I wish I would have had that valor, that ganas, when I was their age. And so I'm always learning from them. So I think maybe this is just wishful thinking, right? But we have an opportunity to redefine what we want in the workforce, and like, what does professionalism look like? Because if there's one thing that has been very important to me is humanity. Like, we respect each other at the human being level. Like, my dad being a Mexican immigrant, he always said in his broken English, like, you may not respect me, but you need to respect me as a human being first, right? So if we do custodial, if we work in healthcare, we're essential workers. If we work in manufacturing, if we are the CEO of a company, we're still human beings. And COVID is looking at all of us at the same time. Some of us a little bit more than others, right? But at the same time, we're human beings. And so for me, while I have these kind of conflicting, like, yes, finally we have the platform and people are ready in my world, ready to listen to certain topics. It's like, well, now I do enjoy being home a little bit more. I do enjoy not having such heavy commutes. I do enjoy to provide service to folks. So let me revamp and let me revisit what that's going to look like for me, right? But I also acknowledge that is a very, very privileged position that I have.
No, for sure. And no, it's funny, like you were talking about what did you say, Zennial? Like what you're learning from the Zennial generation. So because yeah, I mean, I guess when I remember you and some of the people that we would interact with, like there was a time when like you were the one pushing people to like really like think more openly, and I think you still are, but you're also acknowledging that, like, also as you have matured, you're now looking at this new generation. What like, because we're like, I think we're both considered millennials, like elder millennials. We're not,
Yeah.
we're like the upper
Right.
end of that age.
I'm like that first year for a millennial. So whenever it's convenient for me, I'll say I am. And in other spaces, I'm like, oh, those millennial. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I'm still
No,
millennial.
no, for sure. Like, so, because you and I are like at the very like front end of it, and then there's this next generation. I guess, what do you, I guess, what are, like, I guess, what are you seeing to be the qualities, like, especially in your work, like the qualities with them that you're like, oh, the rest of us could take note from them?
I think when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're the ones telling me, like, hey, let's revisit this. I'm like, that was not in my playbook. You're right about that. Why didn't I think of that? So I'm understanding how colonized my training has actually been, right? And part of my I'm sorry?
Dang, like, no, because I've had, like, I'm in a community group, like, focusing on, like, racial issues and all, and I, like, yeah, I'm talking to these, like, early 20 somethings where I'm like, oh, I should have thought of that. But go on.
Right, exactly. So
You're colonized. Talk about.
yes. So I think with whether it be social media, internet, coming of age, and maybe even with 9/11, those questioning the systems that were created to exclude people. I think when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion, Zennials are like, they're on it. And, I made a conscious choice for a master's program at a Hispanic serving institution. I was very privileged to receive a fellowship for that. And my cohort was, it was all Latinx folks, right? And so, like, very different from our University of Illinois experience. And even then, like, we learned how to decolonize, how to, we took some tools in terms of, like, racial identity development theory for different students, right? But even then, like, the students are coming in, they're like, no, we want to defund the police. Let's reassess why we have campus safety, And I'm like, that's right. You do have a point. Let's talk about this. Mm-hmm. So, even when we were in school, that's the generation when we had the pro-immigrant marches, right, throughout the nation. And so I remember attending those, but, we have youth in Chicago and in the city where I live as well that are leading marches. And I'm just like, power to you. My arthritis cannot handle that today. And then they just have when we led the walks, they were in advocacy, and I don't think there were as many threats as there are today. Or we didn't perceive those threats to be there, right? And they were maybe in a larger city where we knew we could call an attorney, in different spaces where there's an established set of resources and advocacy where we could, tie together to make a large rope to support and pull each other up. Mm-hmm. Now I think that for a lot of the Zennial folks, this rope has yet to be developed in spaces outside of larger cities. And they're like, this is urgent. We don't care. We need to get this fixed. And so I applaud them. And I'm just like, yeah, that's a constant, like, push for me to be better. Push for me to check myself, check my privileges, to that's like my textbook now, right? So instead of going through a PhD, I'm like, so what are these kids saying? Where are they coming from? Okay. So what's my plan of action? What's my responsibility as a person in a perceived, leadership role, or in a formal leadership role to change policy within higher education? What is it that in my community where I live, what is it that people need that I can help bridge those, lines of communication, or bring those resources, or help build, entities that I know have existed in other spaces. So that's kind of what I'm walking through.
Jeez. I mean, you've, like, walked us through, like, different practical things, what you're learning from the younger generation. And we have just, like, few minutes left. Is there anything that you really think is worth mentioning that I just didn't know, like a point or a topic I didn't raise where you're like, oh no, we need to dedicate at least a little bit of time to this?
I think it's starting and ending with the youth, right? At least it is for me, in that they are very, very well prepared, much more than some of us with the degrees or years of experience in
Yep.
these fields.
Yes,
These
yes,
kids,
yes.
yes, they know
Yep.
how to get the information. They may not, at times, they may not use the same verbiage that we use in our spaces, but they have the heart and they know what they're talking about. So I think our responsibility is to leverage those voices, to connect them to what we do know, because, and you know, obviously for all of our communities to be in good spaces, but then for allies as well, to help create that area where those voices feel supported and feel safe. So that's actually, like, I think some of the things that I'm taking a note of that I need to continue to work on.
No, and yeah, and you know, something that you said where I'm just like, yes, yes, you're so right, is just, you know, you're right, they don't always have the degrees. They might not always use the like vocabulary we were taught that was most appropriate in such and such scenario. Yeah, sometimes I do say minority and not minoritized, you know, whatever, but it's also, it's, you're right, it's not just about your mind, it's about your heart. And it, you know, it's interesting. I think when I've, especially with me working in higher ed spaces, I've noticed a lot of times when we look for the qualifications on this work, it's like, did so-and-so get a master's or a PhD in social justice, when you and I already know that just even to get that far in someone's education, there could be a lot of barriers there, right? That were already designed into the system. And so I do like what you're saying about just looking to the youth. And also I like how, what I've liked about in this discussion is that you're not just acknowledging, when you talk about leadership, it's not in this hierarchical way. Like I've noticed you've been saying formal, informal, because at the heart of the leadership, it's really about the action than like, hey, what position or what title does
Right.
somebody have? And then also like, you know, I think in these discussions, and again, it's someone like, I've worked in academia a long time, you know, there's always a theory or there's always some data, more data that needs to be done, more data, more data, more data, but they're like 6-year-olds out there marching. And they don't, I don't know, I just sometimes think about it, like they don't need all that data. Like, and they're leading change, and they're out there in ways that like some people like my age or older don't do. But no, I really do appreciate how, like, yeah, I mean, and you have throughout this conversation been so mindful of like the privilege, like even though yes, you have these certain parts of your background that weren't privileged, you also do acknowledge the privilege you have, because I do think it's so easy for me, like in particular, to think of the ways in which all I've been oppressed, but like, what are the ways in which I benefit from these systems too? And how do I leverage that to like, to elevate, like you said, elevate those other voices that need to be heard in this. But yeah, it's been so good to talk to you. I feel like I need to invite you again. But yeah, you're doing such great work, and it's so awesome to just hear about you in this role. And your institution is so lucky to have you, and I'm lucky that you are on here today. But no, but thank you. And so we're just gonna wrap up, and you know, thank you everyone for joining us. And you know, like, yeah, check me out. Well, because I'm doing this informally, it might be in a week, a few days. You'll find out pretty soon. And I'll try to see if I could get Paty back here. But yeah, thank you, Paty, for being here. And thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lindsay. Adios.
Adios.